Ed Lachman, congratulations on your second Oscar nomination for Carol. How did it feel when you got the news that you'd been nominated?
Well, this year, the nominations range from Ultra 70 millimeter to Super 16 millimeter that I photographed in, to 65 millimeter to 2K digital. And we all use different tools to create our vision, but the point is that, how do we create images to create our stories and the looks and with the different formats that it really really shows that there's no limitation to our tools to how we tell our stories visually. And as a cinematographer, we're all telling our stories through the camera and how we create the emotions with the visual language to engage the audience to our story. So I was greatly honored to think that our film, which was a relatively lower budget to the other films being chosen, was chosen for its photographic acumen or photographic stylistic approaches to telling the story. That more and more images, how do we judge our images through a camera, or do we judge them how we create them through a computer? Even though we might create them through, originate those images, more and more our images are being manipulated through a computer. So how do we judge our work? So it was a great honor to have a film like Carol be represented, in which, 98% of that film was in camera. We used digital effects in the streets of Cincinnati, but that there was still an interest or an acknowledgement to original photography.
Mm-hmm. You bring up an interesting point that there is a wide variety of nominees this year. In terms of the kinds of, some are shot on film, some are shot on digital, some are shot on different kinds of film. And I remember 15 years ago, it was digital was sort of this brand new thing that wasn't supposed to be around for too much longer. Now all of a sudden, it's almost a novelty to shoot movies on film. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, in my research, 15 to 25% of films still are being shot on film in Hollywood today, and a lot of them are actually the larger budgeted films, and also a lot of the actors are responding more to the way they look in film than digital. My point is we should all have the same tools to tell our stories, but certain tools create certain looks. And if I equate the look towards the format or the style or the means of creating the images, to me, the digital world creates kind of a photorealistic look at the world. If I refer to painting, digital images for me create more of a world of photorealism, and they have the effect of looking out the window. But not all stories for me have the needs to be told the same way. Some stories need the illusion of distancing with texture, depth, color palette of the film, and there's a difference. Some paintings are affected by the textures of their brushstrokes, i.e. pointillism, impressionism, German expressionism, even some so-called modernism, let's say, of Turner. But I've always loved film because of the color separation and the randomness of the grain structure, which for me gives a certain life to the image. Because grain changes in each frame, like what we do in life, like breathing. and it's not pixel fixated on a flat chip without random grain structure. Now, I know we're all working towards creating images that are closer to film, but I don't think that's a necessary priority. I just think we should accept that the tools that we have in the digital world should fit certain stories, and film can fit other stories, that we don't have to be restricted into one medium to create our images, because we're still using the images to tell stories.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about this in terms of Carol, which you shot on 16 millimeter and then blew up to 35 millimeter. Why was that the appropriate aesthetic choice for that film?
Well, we wanted to reference not the cinema of the book was written in 1949 and got published in 52. And Patricia Highsmith wrote this book, The Price of Salt, and it was a very personal book to her. And she actually had to write it under an assumed name, Claire Morgan. And at the time, it didn't fit into, her first book when she was 28 years old was Strangers on a Train. So it didn't necessarily fit into the crime milieu, but actually, the crime was love. And we wanted to put the camera as much of the structure as the point of view of the characters. So shooting through enclosures and the textures of the rain, dirty windows, conveyed for us something that was hidden. In all the work of Patricia Highsmith, she equated a kind of criminal existence to desire. From Strangers on a Train to Tal and Mr. Ripley, love is a crime, and homosexuality, desire, gets expressed through criminal acts. So we wanted this feeling of viewing Rooney and Cate, or Therese and Carol, from the outside as they were. And so visually, we wanted these textures. And so shooting, it was almost, how can I say it? We wanted to situate and structure a subjective viewpoint of the characters. So shooting through and framing devices of doorways, windows, cars, enclosures, and textures of reflections, rain, weather, and also using the grain of Super 16. We helped define kind of the character's emotions, and that we were trying to create not just a representational view of the world, but a psychological one, the one of a more subjectivity, kind of the isolation of their desire and their romantic imagination. So we wanted this feeling of entrapment. And to get back to why Super 16, so when we looked at that period of what, cinema was melodrama or film noir, we didn't want to reference the cinema at the time, but we wanted to document the times that these women lived in, that Patricia Highsmith wrote about, because it was just after World War II. It was just before Eisenhower was nominated or elected as president. And it was a great uncertainty in America at the time. There was a rise of communism in the Eastern Europe by the Soviet threat, and there was McCarthyism in this country. So it was that time was kind of it wasn't the mid to late 50s as we referenced Douglas Sirk in Far From Heaven. It wasn't that form of optimism through materialism of America at that time, but it was a certain grayness, austerity that fit the emotional quality of those characters, because there was a certain kind of repression and about speaking about what your true feelings or emotions were, or that you were open about your sexuality. And so we wanted to show this kind of restriction and entrapment that the characters fit. So we, documenting and looking at the documentation of the time, we looked at the photojournalists of the time. And we discovered that many of them were women, like Helen Levitt, Ruth Orkin, Esther Bubbly, and then later Vivian Meyer, that was a personal photographer rather than a photojournalist. But and they experimented with color, actually, with ectochrome, because ectochrome at that time, or color, wasn't seen as an art form. It was black and white, you know, if you were a photographer. But they were experimenting with color, and the color wasn't Kodachrome, it was ectochrome. And so I tried to find a way to mimic the way, if you looked at a photograph from that time, and the colors weren't as saturated, they were more muted, they were grayer, and there was a coolness to the image. It wasn't the full range of color negative as you see it today. But then we discovered that in Mildred Pierce, when we had screened a segment of it in Venice, that it held up on the big screen, because you're not going through an inner negative, you're not going through a blow up, you're going from the Super 16 directly into a digital file to, you know, a digital projection, and that that the grain would reference the way film felt back then. So one, it referenced the time period, but two, we realized it also could reference a certain emotion, could create a certain emotional quality, almost from the exterior, that the grain became something that affected the surface by their emotions, something living underneath the surface, viewing the characters through a texture of grain, but also feeling their emotions through the grain, revealing their state of mind. And that we were trying to create this stark live-in reality, a lived-in period reality, then, you know, a stylized period. You know, I think many times we look at periods and we over-romanticize the way it looks. And so that's why we wanted to go to people that were documenting the time as documentarians or photojournalists and not the cinema of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly something that you and Todd Haynes explore a lot in your films. It's looking at what's on the surface and then burrowing deeper underneath, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you're always trying to find the visual metaphor for telling your story. I think that's what we all try to do, you know, or what I try to do with Todd is find the language that's the metaphor for the story and the emotions of the story.
Mm-hmm. I want to go
so
back.
What I was saying about is the reservedness. You didn't express your feelings. Inappropriate to talk about how you felt. All right.
Right.
Sorry. All right. Go on.
Oh no, it's fine. I wanted to go back to what we were talking about earlier in film versus digital, because for about 30 years or so, the Academy divided its award for cinematography into two different categories, one for black and white and one for color. Mm-hmm. Do you think that kind of distinction needs to be made today for film and digital? I mean, should there be two?
Well, in an ideal world, yes, but how do you determine that? You know, and what percentage, and how does one determine how much of the film was digitally enhanced or not? I've discussed this with other cinematographers, and we're all aware of this, but it's a very different. Maybe, as someone said, you know, until we all use it to the same extent, will the playing field be the same? And are we creating video games or amusement rides on the big screen? It's certainly a form of entertainment. It's just not the only way of telling stories. And I'm more into character-driven stories and ideas. So it's a very hard thing to how we judge that as our work, In an ideal world, yes, if we could determine what percentage of the film was digitally enhanced, because how are we being judged? Are we being judged by what images we create through light and our camera telling the story? Or are we being judged by what they do in post?
Mm-hmm.
That's. I mean, one year, what was the film? Avatar was.
Avatar, yeah.
I mean, that was primarily all digital affected. I mean, there's certain films that are. What's interesting? I was just in London at the BSC Expo, and I saw examples of 4K and 4K projected, 4K captured, and then displayed. And what was so amazing to me was here were live images that were captured through a camera in 4K resolution. And the images started to look to me as if they were digital. I mean, not digital, as if they were animated. So maybe we'll get to a point in the digital world where the images don't even look photographic anymore. They'll look like they were visually, digitally enhanced animation. In other words, maybe it's because my eyes grew up on photographic images, and so I'm trying to come to terms with the way images look digitally, or digitally created, or enhanced, or computerized. But maybe this won't even be an issue in a number of years when we only see images this way. I think that's the real. I think we're in this transitional time, and so there's a number of, especially people like myself, that are creating images for the big screen that have these kind of questions. But it's certainly hard to make a judgment of what a cinematographer does and how he should be judged in his work. If the work is now manipulated after he's created the images, even if he's, maybe part of that, then the question is, what part did he play in manipulating the images later? But it's a question, what people are like stabilizing shots, repositioning shots. These are all things that are manipulation of the image that wasn't done on the set. It wasn't done in the on-set photographic process.
There's even more of a difference, too, I think, between something that's just like completely created in a green screen and something where you're using it to just kind of augment it slightly,
Right. But you see, it gets more and more sophisticated. When you shoot in real locations, or in, how can I say it? When you're shooting in a form of naturalism, but you manipulate that's when it gets tricky, If you start rotoscoping all your shots, if you separate the characters from the background and change the background, then you're not capturing the light that was existing then.
it makes you wonder too. I mean, moving forward 20 to 30 years from now, if you make a movie like Carol,
you just dial in the grain. You say, oh,
yeah.
you want Super 16? Yeah, maybe it is. But, there's something about the photographic process that you can't, how can I say, prefigure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think gives Carol, if it does, a certain credibility and magic to some of the images. And I can honestly say in some of the reflections and the way the lens is working against the light and the night and I didn't really know myself exactly how it was going to be. I mean, that's the how can I say, that's the mystery and the magic of cinema, that you get something back that you didn't necessarily see, Thanks ever so much.
You're welcome. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye.